Welcome. You're here now, and that is enough. Let your body find the surface beneath it, the mattress, the cushion, the particular give of the thing that is holding you, and allow that surface to do its work without your help. You do not need to hold yourself up. You have not needed to for some time. Simply breathe once and then again, and allow the breath to be slower than the last one, and quieter and fuller in the way that breath becomes when the body finally understands it is safe. Tonight we're going to travel together through something enormous, not violent, not urgent. We're going to move through the long, quiet aftermath of a single decision made by one man, a man of extraordinary intelligence and ordinary human love, whose final act rearranged the architecture of an entire universe. You do not need to track every detail. You do not need to hold anything in your hands. Simply let the story come to you, the way warmth comes through a window in the early morning, gradually and without effort, until you are surrounded by it. His name was Tony Stark. You know it already. Most people in most corners of the world that produced him knew it. But the version of that name they knew, the headline version, the magazine cover version, the press conference version, was never quite the whole story. The whole story was quieter. It lived in workshops at odd hours, and in the specific way he looked at the people he could not afford to lose, and in the slow, painful process of a man who had spent his entire life building walls, finally deciding, one brick at a time, to take them down. By the time the final moment came, he had been living quietly for 5 years. This matters. It is not a small thing, those 5 years. He had a house by a lake, and the house had a dock that extended out over the water, and in the early mornings he would stand on that dock while the mist was still low, and the light was still soft, and he would hold a cup of coffee, and watch the surface of the water, and feel, this is the important part, he would feel that the surface of the water was enough, that the morning was enough, that being present in a moment without building toward the next one was a form of competence he had finally, at great cost, managed to acquire. There was a daughter, Morgan, small and bright and entirely her own person in the way that children are before the world begins its long work of suggesting otherwise. She called him dumb names with the fluent affection of someone who has already determined that the person in front of her is safe to love without reservation, and he received this with the specific quality of gratitude that belongs only to people who have spent most of their lives uncertain whether they deserve to be loved that simply. He had learned to receive it. That was its own kind of engineering, the patient, unglamorous work of staying open to something good. Pepper was there, and what they had built together across the long uneven years had settled into something that did not require explanation or maintenance, or the management of distance. It was simply there, the way a wall is simply there, not demanding attention but reliable in the way that only things built with genuine care over genuine time tend to be. He had, in other words, arrived somewhere. After decades of brilliant, driven, partially self-destructive motion, he had reached a place where the motion could stop, and what remained was not emptiness, but the thing the motion had always been looking for. When they came to him, Steve, Natasha, with their theory about time and their desperate arithmetic about what might still be possible, he did not say yes immediately. He said no. He said no in the specific way that people say no when they mean I cannot afford to lose what I have finally found. He sent them away, and he stood in the kitchen, and he held the thing they had asked of him at arm's length, and then he put it down, and he went to find Morgan, and he watched her sleep, and he told himself that the life he had built was the life he was meant to protect, not the one he was meant to sacrifice. But the mind that never stopped building would not leave the problem alone. He worked through the night, not because he intended to, but because the question was in the room with him the way questions always had been, present and demanding and unwilling to accept a closed door. By morning he had solved it. The time travel mathematics, the precise configuration of the quantum tunnel that everyone else had been unable to make work. He saw it, turned it in his hands the way he turned all his best solutions, and understood that it was correct. What he felt in that moment was not triumph. Sit with that for a breath. Let your body be still and consider it. The man who had built weapons and suits and towers and systems designed to reduce the possibility of harm, the man whose intelligence had always expressed itself as solutions, had just solved the equation that would carry him toward the end of his own life. And what he felt was not triumph, but something quieter and more complicated, something adjacent to resignation, something that knew. He made the call. He built the device. He drove to the compound with the solution in the car beside him, and he gave it over, and in the giving it became real in the way that things only become real when you release them from the privacy of your own hands. There was no ceremony in this. There was coffee and a briefing and the technical language of people who understand what they are building and are moving too efficiently to feel the full weight of it yet. The weight would come later. For him, it came in the space between decisions, between the moment he handed over the solution and the moment he understood that he had already made the choice that would follow from it. The battlefield arrived with the particular chaos of battles that have been dreamed about and prepared for, and that are still somehow more than anything preparation can fully absorb. Thanos came with the full weight of a certainty so complete it had become indistinguishable from righteousness in his own understanding. His army was real and present and everywhere, and the heroes who gathered against them were carrying 5 years of grief and fracture, and the specific weariness of people who had lived in the wreckage of an incomplete world. Tony fought. He fought the way he had always fought, with everything the suit could give, which was more than anything else in the field, and with the precise economical intelligence of someone who has long understood that the goal is not to demonstrate power, but to end the situation. He was hurt. The armor was not unlimited. He had built its limits himself, and he knew them precisely, and as the fight moved and shifted around him, he was tracking those limits the way a pilot tracks fuel, constantly, calmly, without alarm. Doctor Strange caught his eye across the chaos, one finger raised. Of the 14 million possible futures that Strange had surveyed, one remained in which the outcome was survival for the universe entire. Tony did not need the context explained. He had known Strange long enough to understand what the gesture meant. The knowledge arrived quietly and settled without drama into the place where he kept the things that could not be argued with. Thanos held the gauntlet, 6 stones, the work of destruction nearly complete, nearly irreversible, nearly settled, and Tony Stark, bleeding and exhausted and more certain than he had been of anything since the morning 5 years ago when he had stood on the dock watching mist over water, reached out and took the stones from the gauntlet with the quiet efficiency of someone performing a task they have already decided to perform regardless of the cost. His suit could not survive it. The energy involved was not survivable by anything designed to protect a human body, and he had designed the suit, and he knew this. He looked at Thanos and he said the words. 5 words. A full stop of a sentence that reversed the weight of every declaration he had ever made about himself, every performance of invulnerability, every carefully managed distance between the man and the world he had been so afraid to fully inhabit. Then he snapped his fingers. The light came. The silence after it was different from all previous silences, the silence of absence rather than the silence of pause. Dust, the slow, gentle dissolution of an army that had assembled with the absolute confidence of inevitability and found itself, in one moment, wrong. The world the light left behind was not the same world it had found. That is the only honest way to say it. The universe rearranged itself around the space where Tony Stark had been standing, and what it arranged itself into was something he had made possible through the precise expenditure of everything he had. Pepper was there when he died. She knelt beside him on the broken ground, and she told him that they would be okay. It is worth understanding what that cost her to say. It is worth understanding that the words were true, and that their truth did not make them easier to speak, only more necessary. He heard her, and then the suit's light went out, and the small blue glow that had lived in his chest since the cave in Afghanistan. That quiet, constant light that had begun as a device to keep shrapnel from his heart, and become, over time, a symbol so complete that even people who had never met him associated it with the concept of someone choosing to keep going. That light went out too. Breathe now. There is no need to hold any of this tightly. Let your body release whatever it has been carrying through these paragraphs. Let your shoulders find the surface beneath them. The story does not require your tension to be real. It is already real. It happened in the way that all things happen in the worlds we love, completely and irrevocably, and it left behind a shape in the universe the precise dimensions of one man's courage. What followed was grief, but grief of a particular, complicated kind, the kind that attaches itself to a loss that is also, inescapably, a gift. The people who had known him carried it differently. Steve carried it with the quiet weight of someone who had argued with Tony for years about the right way to protect the world, and who would spend the rest of his own life understanding that Tony had, in the end, simply done it. Rhodey carried it with the particular sorrow of people who knew the person behind the headlines, who understood that the man the world was mourning and the man he had grown up beside were the same person, and that the world's version of the story was missing most of what made the person worth missing. And Peter. Let the thought of Peter settle in gently. Peter Parker, who had looked at Tony Stark across a decade of growing up and found there the exact combination of qualities, the brilliance, the fundamental decency buried under performance, the willingness to keep going anyway, that a person needs to find in someone when they are trying to understand what kind of person to become. Peter had lost him before, in the dust of Thanos' first snap, and had found him again, and had fought beside him in that final field, and had been held by him in the moments before the battle began, in the way that a father holds a person they have not known how to say they love. Tony's legacy lived in Peter the way legacies always live best. Not as an instruction, but as a standard. Not as a rule, but as a question. What would you be willing to lose for the thing that matters? That question did not end with Tony. It travelled. It found its way into every decision that came after, in every hero who looked at what had been done and had to ask themselves how they measured up to it. The snap had cost one man everything, and given the universe back to itself. And the universe that received this gift was changed not only by its restoration, but by the knowledge of what restoration had required. Something had shifted in the understanding of what heroism meant, of what it asked. of where its outermost edge was located. Tony Stark had lived his life building outward toward that edge without quite knowing where it was. In the end, he found it, and in finding it, he left it behind him like a marker, so that everyone who came after could see how far a person could go. Let that thought carry you now, like a current carries something downstream, gently and without effort, towards somewhere quieter than where you began. There is more to come, but for now, let your breath be slow and your body be heavy, and the image of a small blue light, steady and warm and sufficient, hold you through the dark. Let your body settle a little more. If there is any part of you still carrying the posture of the day, a tightness in the shoulders, a jaw that has not yet unclenched, a breath that has not yet reached all the way down, allow it to release now, without effort, simply by noticing it. The noticing is enough. The body knows what to do when you stop asking it to stay ready, and tonight there is nothing to stay ready for. Tonight the only work is listening, and listening requires nothing of you but the willingness to be still. There is a particular quality to the absence of a person who was also a centre of gravity, when someone around whom others have organised themselves, not through demand or design, but through the simple fact of their presence, the way they thought, the way they move through problems, the specific frequency of their particular intelligence. When that person is gone, the absence is not simply the removal of an individual. It is a structural change. The architecture that formed around them remains for a time, holding the shape of the person who is no longer there, the way a hand continues to feel the weight of something it has just set down. The Avengers, after Tony's death, existed in exactly this condition. They were still present. They were still capable. They retained all the individual capabilities that had made them formidable long before he had joined them, and in some cases long before Iron Man had existed at all. But the specific configuration of the team, the way its parts had oriented toward one another, the roles each member occupied relative to all the others, the unspoken agreements about who made which kinds of calls and whose voice carried which kinds of weight, all of this had been shaped over years by his presence, and with him gone, it shifted. Steve felt it most directly, and perhaps most strangely, because Steve and Tony's relationship had never been simple. They had argued with the specific ferocity of people who shared fundamental values and disagreed profoundly about method, who cared about the same things and understood those things differently enough that the caring itself became a source of friction. The arguments had been real. The fracture over the accords had been real, had produced genuine rupture and genuine loss, and had carried between them for years with the weight of something neither had found a way to fully resolve. And then Tony had died, and the unresolved thing became permanent, had hardened from an ongoing disagreement between two living people into a finished thing, fixed and unalterable. What Steve carried in the months after the snap was not precisely guilt, though it resembled guilt in some of its qualities. It was more specific than guilt, the feeling that belongs to people who have outlived the end of an argument they had not finished making, who will never know what the other person would have said next, who are left holding their half of a conversation that will never reach its natural conclusion. They had come back together at the end. They had fought side by side in that final battle in the way they had always fought best, without the friction of ideology, simply two people with extraordinary capability moving toward the same objective with everything they had. But the years between were still there, unaddressed, and Tony's death had sealed them in place. Natasha had understood Tony in a way that was not widely appreciated, because Natasha understood most people in ways that were not widely appreciated, this being the particular skill her history had produced in her, the ability to read someone completely while revealing very little of the reading. She had seen, from the time of her early surveillance of him, that the performance was exactly that, a performance, elaborate and consistent and genuinely entertaining, but not coextensive with the person performing it. She had seen the discipline underneath the apparent chaos, the genuine ethical orientation underneath the apparent self-interest, the fear underneath the confidence. She had filed all of this away and used none of it to manipulate him, which was the kind of restraint that cost her something, and which Tony, if he had known about it, would have understood as one of the more significant expressions of respect he had ever been shown. Her death on Vormir, the Red Stone, the impossible exchange, had preceded Tony's by a matter of hours in the arc of that terrible day. She had made the same fundamental choice he made, had understood in the same terms he would later understand it, that the cost of the thing they needed was the thing she was not willing to let someone else pay in her place. The symmetry of these two deaths, two people who had known each other for years, who had circled each other with the mutual wariness of people who recognize in the other a quality they have spent time trying to understand, was not lost on the people who survived them both. It said something about what the team had been built from, about the specific quality of person that the project had attracted and shaped. Thor's grief was larger and less contained than the others, expressed in the way that all of Thor's emotions expressed themselves, with a physical dimension, a heaviness that was visible in how he moved and where he stood, and how long he looked at things before he spoke. He had known Tony for a long time in the way that people who have fought beside each other know each other, which is different from the knowing that comes from shared meals and long conversations and the accumulated ordinary hours of a friendship. But the fighting beside had its own depth, its own specific kind of trust. Thor understood that Tony had been the one who solved the equation, who built the device, who made the mission possible. He carried this knowledge with the weight it deserved. Bruce had come back from his years away changed in a way that was still settling into a stable form when the final crisis arrived. The two halves of who he was negotiated into something new and quieter and less at war with itself. He had known Tony longer than most of the others, had worked beside him in the early days of the team's formation, and the specific texture of that early collaboration, two extremely intelligent people in a lab together, each genuinely interested in what the other could see, was a thing he did not have anywhere else. Tony had looked at the science of what Bruce was and had been consistently, unfailingly interested rather than afraid, which was not nothing, for a person whose nature had spent decades frightening people. The team that gathered in the aftermath of the snap's reversal and Tony's death was the same team in membership, and not the same team in essence. Something had been redistributed. The weight that Tony had carried, not just the practical weight of his technology and his resources and his intelligence, but the subtler weight of his particular way of understanding what the team was for and how it should operate. That weight had dispersed into the air, and the others were breathing it now, each taking in whatever portion their particular character could absorb. This is what happens to the substance of someone who was central. It does not disappear, it redistributes. The compound needed rebuilding after the battle, which was practical work, and practical work is one of the things that grieving people are sometimes grateful for. The specific mercy of tasks that are large enough to occupy the hands and the immediate mind without requiring the deeper engagement that grief tends to resist. People moved through the wreckage and they counted what remained and they made the decisions that needed to be made about what came next, and underneath all of it, The absence was present in the way that absences always are, not loudly but consistently, the way a missing step on a staircase is present every time someone climbs the stairs. The question of who was in charge now was not asked aloud for some time, because asking it aloud would have required acknowledging what the question was really about, which was the specific vacancy that Tony's death had created at the organisational centre of the team. He had not been the leader in any formal sense for much of the team's history. Steve had held that role, and then it had been complicated by the fracture, and then it had resolved into something more distributed and less hierarchical in the years of rebuilding. But Tony's voice had always been among the loudest in the conversations about direction, and his resources had always been among the most decisive in determining what was actually possible, and his particular quality of practical urgency, the sense that problems had solutions and that the correct response to a problem was to find the solution quickly using whatever was available, had shaped the team's culture in ways that persisted after him. Sit with this for a moment, very gently. Let your breath be slow. Consider the specific phenomenon of a shape that remains after the thing that made it has gone. The indent in a pillow, the worn path through grass, the particular silence of a room that has recently held a person. These are not sad things exactly. They are evidence. They are proof that something real was there, that it occupied space, that it changed the material of the world it moved through. Tony Stark had moved through the world of the Avengers for years, and the shape of that movement was still visible in every arrangement they now occupied, every decision they now faced, every choice they now made about what kind of team they intended to be. What gradually emerged in the months after was not a replacement for Tony, but a reorientation around his absence. The team did not collapse, because teams built from people of genuine quality rarely collapse when they lose a central member. They adapt, and the adaptation is painful and slow, and produces something different from what preceded it, but the underlying capacity for coherent action survives. New configurations found themselves. New voices moved into the spaces that had been his. The technology that he had built and left behind continued to function, its systems maintained by the people he had trained and the engineers who understood what he had created and who approached the work of maintaining it with the particular reverence that belongs to custodians of something they did not make. This is the texture of grief when it belongs to a group rather than an individual. Not a single wave, but a distributed pressure, felt differently by each person, arriving in different forms at different times, producing different rearrangements in different corners of the structure it moves through. Steve would eventually make his choice to rest, to return to a different time, and find the life he had been unable to live in the present. Thor would find his way toward something new. Bruce would continue the long, considered work of being who he had become. Rhodey would carry the weight of the armour and everything the armour meant forward into a future that Tony had purchased. Each of them moved through the reshaped space he'd left, oriented differently toward the horizon, carrying what they could carry of who he had been. And above all of this, above the grief and the redistribution, and the slow adaptation of the team to its new configuration, there was the fact of what he had done, not who he had been. That was complex, layered, contradictory in the ways that all real people are contradictory, more interesting and more difficult than any simple narrative could contain. But what he had done, the decision, the device, the 5 words, the snap, that act existed outside the complexity. It was simple in the way that only truly significant things are simple, stripped of qualification by the finality of its outcome. He had done it, and it had worked, and the world that received the working of it was the world they were all living in now. Every morning they woke into his legacy. Every breath they took in a restored universe was in some sense a breath he had made possible. Let that thought be soft in your mind, not sharp. Let it settle the way warmth settles, gradually and from the outside in. You're resting now, and the story will continue to move around you, and there is nothing you need to hold. Simply drift with it as the current finds its way. Allow your breath to find its own pace now. Not the pace you decide for it, but the pace it chooses when you stop directing it. When you simply observe it moving in and then out, quieter each time, deeper without effort, until the space between the inhale and the exhale becomes somewhere you could almost rest. You're already resting. Your body has been waiting for this permission since long before you lay down. It knows exactly what to do. There is a particular kind of mentorship that happens without being named. It does not announce itself. It does not establish rules or expectations or formal exchanges of knowledge. It simply occurs across the space between two people who are in proximity at the right moment. One of them at the beginning of something, the other somewhere in the middle, and the one in the middle carrying something that the one at the beginning does not yet know they need. The exchange is quiet. It happens in the margins of other things, but it shapes the person who receives it in ways that no formal instruction could produce, because its source is not a lesson but a presence. Peter Parker was 15 when he first encountered Tony Stark. 15, which is an age at which a person is simultaneously entirely formed and completely unfinished. Old enough to have a recognizable character, a set of values, a way of moving through the world that is already distinctly their own, and young enough that the framework supporting all of it is still being constructed, still vulnerable to the specific kinds of influence that arrive from people whose lives offer a picture of what the future might look like. Peter had the values already. The brilliance was already operational, expressing itself in the modifications he made to his equipment and the precision of his physical movement through space and the specific quality of attention he brought to problems. What he did not yet have was a map. Tony arrived in his life in the manner of someone who'd been watching from a distance and had decided the time had come for closer engagement. He arrived with resources and skepticism and the particular quality of assessment that comes from someone who has spent years identifying capability in unexpected places and has learned to trust that instinct even when the source is surprising. He looked at Peter with the complete attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what they are seeing, evaluated what he found with the directness of someone who has no patience for softening accurate observations, and then engaged with what was there in front of him fully. Because Tony's relationship to genuine talent was uncomplicated, he recognized it, and he could not ignore it. What Peter received from Tony was not primarily technology, though the technology was real and significant, and represented a quality of investment that Peter would not have been able to access anywhere else. What he received was a way of thinking about responsibility. Tony had arrived at his own understanding of that word through a long and painful process of reckoning, through the cave, through Yinsen, through the years of understanding what his weapons had done in the world, through the slow replacement of performance with presence that had defined the decade of his maturity. The understanding he had earned was precise and uncompromising. The possession of capability creates the obligation to use it correctly, and the definition of correctly is not negotiable and not relative and not subject to the convenient exceptions that self-interest tends to generate. He transmitted this understanding to Peter not through speeches or instruction, but through the texture of how he treated him, the expectations he held without explaining why he held them, the specific quality of his disappointment when Peter made decisions that prioritized the immediate and the exciting over the considered and the sustainable, the equal specificity of his approval when Peter demonstrated the kind of judgment that the responsibility required. These were not performances. Tony Stark was not, by the time he became involved in Peter's life, a man who performed his values. He was a man who had arrived through considerable difficulty at the condition of simply having them, and what Peter observed in him across the years of their relationship was the living demonstration of what it looked like to actually inhabit the thing you claim to believe. The snap took Peter first. He was on the battlefield in Titan when it happened, when the light went out of half the universe and Thanos stood in the altered air with the completed gauntlet and the terrible, satisfied certainty of someone whose calculation has just proved correct. Peter felt it coming before it arrived, the specific wrongness of his own body beginning to fail from the inside, the absence where presence had been, the dissolution of the physical fact of himself. He reached for Tony in those final seconds with the frightened urgency of someone whose understanding of safety has a specific face and specific hands, and Tony held him with the quality of holding that belongs to people who understand that holding is all there is left to offer, and who do not flinch from that understanding. 5 years passed in which Peter Parker did not exist, which is a sentence that requires a breath after it. 5 years in which the world continued its altered existence without him, in which Tony built the life at the lake and learned the texture of peace, and held his daughter in the mornings, and watched the water, and allowed himself to believe that the life he was living was the life he was meant to be living now. 5 years in which every morning Tony was alive was a morning Peter was not. The asymmetry of this is something to sit with quietly, without pulling it too tight. When Peter came back, he came back into a world that had continued without him, a world in which his mentor had had 5 years to find what Tony had spent his entire adult life looking for, and had found it, and was being asked to risk it again. The reunion was brief. The crisis did not allow for the kind of conversation that the years of absence deserved. But there was the hug, which said what the years had accumulated, and what the battlefield did not have language for, and then there was the fighting, and then there was the moment in which Peter held the gauntlet, held the thing that Tony would eventually use, that would eventually cost Tony everything, and ran. He was not present at the moment of the snap. He was in the field, fighting, as Tony stood with the stones and understood what he was about to do. The knowledge of what happened reached Peter, the way such knowledge always reaches people who are at some remove from the moment itself, through the changed quality of the air, through the stillness that fell over the field, through the faces of the people who were closer and who understood before he did. He got there in time to be present with Tony's body, which was already past the point of consciousness, already in the process of the slow transition from being a person to being a memory. He knelt there and he said the name. He said it the way people say the names of those they love when there is nothing else to say, not as a question and not as a plea, but simply as the acknowledgement that the person existed and that their existence mattered. What Peter carried forward from that moment was not simple. Grief is never simple, and grief for a person who was also a teacher, and also an example, and also the primary external source of a standard you are trying to meet, is especially layered, especially resistant to the clean narrative that loss sometimes permits. He carried the loss, and he also carried the inheritance, and these two things were not separate. The inheritance was inseparable from the loss. He had what Tony had given him precisely because Tony had given it while alive, while present, while capable of demonstrating what it looked like in practice. And now, practice was Peter's alone. The question Tony had left him, not in words, not in any formal transmission, but in the aggregate of everything their years together had shown Peter about what it meant to take capability seriously, was the question every genuine mentor eventually leaves. What will you do with what you were given? Not what will you do with the suit, though the suit was part of it. Not what will you do with the technology, though the technology was there. What will you do with the understanding, the specific, hard-won, carefully embodied understanding that the possession of power without the accompanying weight of responsibility is not a gift but a danger, and that the weight is not a cost to be minimized but the essential thing, the part that makes the whole legitimate. Pause here with me for a moment. Let your body be entirely still. Outside, the night is doing whatever nights do, the air moving softly or not at all, the darkness complete or fractured by whatever light finds its way in. You're inside it, in the warmth, and the story is around you, and Peter Parker is 17 years old in the universe this story belongs to, carrying the weight of something he was not yet supposed to be carrying, moving forward anyway because the alternative to forward is not rest but regression. And he had been shown, by a man who had spent a lifetime learning it, that regression was not something his values could accommodate. The world Peter existed in after the snap was not the world Tony had been preparing him for, because no preparation could have included this specific outcome. But it was close enough to the territory that the preparation covered, that the preparation held, the values transferred, the understanding of what the responsibility required transferred, the specific quality of attention that Tony had modelled, the willingness to look at a problem without flinching, to acknowledge what it actually contained rather than what you wished it contained, to bring your full capability to bear without reservation. That transferred too. He wore a different suit eventually. He rebuilt what needed to be rebuilt and carried what needed to be carried, and moved through the world with the specific combination of youth and seriousness that his particular inheritance produced. He made mistakes because he was young and because mistakes are how the understanding deepens. And because Tony had made mistakes too, and had understood that the making of mistakes was not disqualifying, but was in fact the mechanism through which the values get tested against the real, and either hold or require revision. Peter's values held. They held because they were genuinely his, absorbed and transformed and owned by the person he'd been becoming. No longer merely an imitation of what he'd been shown, but the real thing, present in him the way real things are present, as something he could not separate from himself even if he had wanted to. This is Tony Stark's most durable legacy in the person of Peter Parker. Not the technology, not the name, not any specific instruction, but the living demonstration, absorbed across years of proximity, of what it looks like to take the responsibility seriously enough that it becomes inseparable from who you are. Tony had spent most of his life learning that. Peter received the fruit of that learning from someone who had already done the hard work of earning it. The transmission was imperfect and incomplete, as all transmissions between people are, but it held, and it continues to hold, in every decision Peter makes in a world that Tony Stark purchased with everything he had. Rest now into the quiet. The story continues, but your body can move deeper into the surface that holds you, can release a little more of whatever remains. You are safe here. The world is being taken care of. Let yourself drift. The room you are in is quiet now. Whatever sounds the day carried with it have thinned to almost nothing, and what remains is the soft, unremarkable sound of a world that has stopped requiring anything of you. Your breath is slower than it was when you began. Your hands are open, or close to open, resting without purpose in the way that hands rest when they have finally accepted that there is nothing left to hold. This is the right place to be. This is exactly where this kind of listening happens best. Everything Tony Stark built continued after him. This is one of the stranger aspects of being an architect. The things you design outlast the designing of them, continue to function according to the principles you embedded in their structure. Keep producing the outputs you intended long after your intentions have become inaccessible. The buildings stand, the systems run, the processes execute, and the question that the continuation raises for the people who inherit the architecture is the question that all inherited architecture raises eventually. What does the builder's intention require of us now, in circumstances the builder never anticipated? Stark Industries was, by the time of Tony's death, an entity of enormous complexity, a company that had been through more fundamental transformations in the span of a single human lifetime than most institutions undergo in centuries. It had begun as a weapons manufacturer and had become something else, something harder to name precisely because the transformation had been ongoing rather than complete, driven by Tony's evolving understanding of what the company should be in the world and expressed in incremental decisions that had moved the organization steadily in a direction whose final destination he had never quite articulated. Pepper Potts had been running the company in the practical sense for years before Tony's death formalized what had already been true. She knew its operations with the granular comprehensiveness of someone who'd been paying close attention to every dimension of the enterprise for a very long time. Not because she'd been preparing for this specific moment, but because Pepper's relationship to attention was simply thorough. She watched everything carefully, because incomplete attention to complex systems tends to produce outcomes that careful attention would have prevented. And she had seen too many such outcomes to be satisfied with less than complete. What she had not been given, and could not have been given, was Tony's instinct. The specific quality of perception that he brought to technological questions, the ability to see in a nascent idea the shape of its full development, to hold in mind simultaneously the technical constraints and the human implications and the ethical dimensions of any given direction, and to weigh them against each other with a speed and accuracy that no deliberate process could fully replicate. This was not transferable. It was not a methodology. It was a form of intelligence particular to the person who possessed it, which had expressed itself through the organization for decades, and which was now simply absent. The engineers who remained were extraordinary people. Many of them had been recruited by Tony personally, identified through the same instinct that had identified Peter Parker, the recognition of genuine capability in unexpected or early form, the willingness to invest in development rather than only improve an output. They understood what they were doing technically. They could maintain and extend the existing systems with high fidelity to the principles that had generated them. What they could not do was replace the source, could not reproduce the original quality of perception that had decided which problems were worth solving and which directions were worth pursuing, and which ideas contained, underneath their rough initial form, the seed of something that would eventually matter. The company moved forward because companies do. The revenue continued because the technology that Tony had built over decades was genuinely excellent and remained excellent after him, requiring maintenance rather than reinvention. New products emerged from the development pipelines he had established. Contracts were honoured, obligations were met. From the outside, the enterprise was indistinguishable from the enterprise it had been while he was alive. Perhaps more stable, in fact, freed from the specific volatility that his personal involvement had always introduced. The sudden redirections and the abandoned projects and the late-night decisions that had seemed impulsive and had often proved prescient. But the direction was different, not immediately visible in any single decision, but present in the aggregate of decisions over time, in the gradual drift of the company's focus away from the frontier and toward the consolidation of what had already been achieved. This was not incompetence. It was the natural behaviour of institutions that have lost the particular form of intelligence that was responsible for their willingness to move toward the unknown. The engineers could build what Tony had pointed at. They could not point at things he had not yet pointed at. The pointing had been his alone, and it had left with him. Pepper understood this distinction, and spent considerable time and effort attempting to address it, attempting to create, through structure and deliberate process, some approximation of the forward orientation that Tony had maintained through instinct. She brought in advisors and established research initiatives and created internal competitions for novel ideas, and did all of the things that organizations do when they understand that they have lost something and are attempting to reconstruct it through institutional design. Some of these efforts produced genuine results. None of them reproduced the original thing, because the original thing was not a process. It was a person. The technology he had left behind in the area of clean energy was perhaps the most significant institutional inheritance, because it pointed most clearly in the direction that Tony had believed the company's future should travel. He had understood, with the engineer's practical certainty, rather than the idealist's vague hope, that energy was the constraint that governed most of the other problems worth solving, that every meaningful advance in human capability eventually ran up against the question of where the power came from and what it cost. And he had devoted a substantial portion of his most creative years to the specific engineering problems that stood between the current state of energy production and something genuinely better. The arc reactor technology had been personal first, developed in extremity, and then refined across years of iteration, and its principles were sound in ways that Tony had understood and that the engineers who inherited it were still working to fully comprehend. The exploration of its implications, the question of what a sufficiently miniaturized, sufficiently efficient, sufficiently clean power source made possible for the world beyond the man inside the suit, was the work that continued most faithfully in his spirit after him, because it was the work where his fingerprints were most present in the underlying principles, and where the direction he had pointed was most clearly marked. Let the image of that settle for a moment. The work continuing, the direction persisting. Not Tony himself. He was gone, and the specific quality of his intelligence and his particular way of seeing the shape of what was possible was gone with him. But the vector of the work, the general heading that his decades of effort had established, persisting in the institutional culture he had created, and in the technology he had built, and in the people he had developed. This is another form of legacy, distinct from the personal one that lived in Peter, and in Rhodey, and in Steve. This is the institutional form, the one that lives in organizations and systems and processes rather than in individuals, that propagates through culture rather than through personal transmission. The philosophical question that haunted Stark Industries in the years after Tony was not simply what to build, but what to be. What the company's relationship to the world should look like when the person who had most clearly articulated that relationship was no longer present to embody it. Tony had not written his values down in any systematic form. He had not produced a manifesto or a mission statement that captured the full depth of what he had come to believe about the relationship between technological capability and human consequence. He had simply lived those values, expressed them through thousands of decisions, large and small, embedded them in the culture through the accumulated weight of consistent action across years of leadership. What remained when he was gone was not a text, but a texture, the feel of decisions made in a particular spirit, which was recognizable to the people who'd been present for it, and which could not be fully transmitted to people who had not. The engineers who had worked closely with Tony carried the texture more faithfully than those who had come to the company later. There was a generation of Stark Industries people for whom the question, "What would Tony think?" was not a slogan, but a genuine cognitive tool, a way of orienting toward a decision that could actually produce useful guidance, because they had enough accumulated observation of how he actually thought to make the question answerable in specific rather than vague terms. For this generation, the legacy was a living instrument, a way of checking their own reasoning against the standard of someone whose reasoning they'd been watching for years. The harder question was what happened when this generation passed, when the people with direct access to the texture retired or moved on and were replaced by people who had only the institutional version, the formalized policies and the official statements and the public record, which was real, but which was to the texture what a map is to the territory it represents, useful, accurate in its way, and fundamentally unable to reproduce the experience of being in the actual place. Every institution eventually faces this transition, the moment when living memory is replaced by institutional memory, when the person who knew becomes replaced by the record of what was known. Tony's death had accelerated this transition at Stark Industries, had removed the living source before the full transmission was complete, and the gap between the texture as he had inhabited it and the texture as the institution would eventually codify it was one of the genuine losses of those years. The Morgan dimension of this was perhaps the most privately significant. Tony had named her his beneficiary in the specific technical sense, and Pepper administered this on her behalf, but the real inheritance that Morgan carried was less about assets and more about possibility, the specific quality of possibility that belongs to people who grow up in environments saturated with the evidence that hard problems can be solved, that intelligence deployed patiently and consistently against difficulty tends to produce results, that the world is in principle susceptible to being made better by people who are willing to do the actual work of making it better. She was too young at the time of his death to understand the full dimensions of what she had lost. She would grow into that understanding gradually over years, in the way that orphaned children grow into the understanding of what was taken from them. Not all at once, but incrementally, each new stage of development revealing a new angle on the absence, a new category of thing she would have needed him for, that she was now navigating without him. But she had something that could not be taken. The years before, however few they were, the specific texture of his attention during those years, the quality of his presence in the house by the lake in the mornings when the mist was low and the light was soft, and he was standing on the dock with his coffee, already aware of her behind him, already adjusting his stance slightly to make room for her to fit beside him. What Stark Industries became in the decades after Tony was something he would have recognized, and something he would have critiqued. Recognized because the core values he had worked to embed were present in the organization's decisions and in the culture that his hiring had produced. critiqued because the frontier he had been pointed toward was no longer being approached with the urgency he had brought to it, because institutions without their originating intelligence tend to consolidate rather than advance, to protect rather than explore. He would have been impatient. He always had been. The impatience had been one of his defining qualities, the engine that converted his intelligence into forward motion, rather than into the satisfied possession of what was already understood. But the work continued. The technology kept running. The clean energy research kept advancing slowly, without the dramatic acceleration he would have given it, but in the right direction. The company continued to exist as a force in the world, shaped by his values, oriented by his directions, carrying forward the institutional memory of what he had believed and what he had built and what he had been trying, at the time of his death, to make real. It is one of the ways a person persists after they are gone, in the institutions they created and the systems they designed and the culture they instilled. Imperfectly, incompletely, but really, the breath is very slow now. Let it be slower still. Let the image of a lit workshop, the quiet hum of something building, the glow of work being done, carry you gently forward into the next part of the story and, if you are ready, into the deeper quiet that lies beyond it. You have come a long way tonight, not in distance, but in depth. The kind of depth that opens beneath a person when they allow themselves to stop moving and simply be present with something that matters. Your body is heavier now than when you began. Your breath is slower. The room around you has taken on the particular quality that rooms acquire in the late hours, familiar, intimate, safe in the way of places that have absorbed a person's presence over time and learned to hold it gently. Rest here for a moment before the story resumes. There is no hurry. What Tony Stark did in the final moment on the battlefield was not, in the universe's accounting, primarily a physical act. The physical dimension of it, the transfer of the stones from the gauntlet to the suit, the snap, the energy released, was real and consequential, but it was the expression of something else, something that had been taking shape in him across the entire arc of his life and had arrived in that moment at its natural conclusion. What he did was philosophical before it was physical. It was the embodiment of a position he'd been working toward for decades without knowing that it was a position. The position was this: that the possession of extraordinary capability creates extraordinary obligation, and that the measure of a person is what they are willing to pay when the bill comes due. Tony had arrived at this position through a process that was nothing like a philosophical argument. It was more like a slow education conducted by circumstances, each major event of his adult life teaching the same lesson from a different angle, until the lesson was no longer a proposition to be evaluated, but a fact about who he was. The cave had been the first real installation of the lesson, not the abstract version, not the general principle that weapons have consequences, and that people who build weapons are implicated in those consequences, but the specific, physical, irreversible version. The lesson arrived as shrapnel and as darkness, and as the particular quality of aloneness that belongs to people who have understood, in a very immediate way, that their life depends on what they are about to build. Yinsen, dying, had made the terms explicit. Whatever Tony built with whatever time remained needed to mean something, needed to be worth the cost that had already been paid on his behalf. The arc reactor in the cave was not only a survival device, it was a commitment. Every subsequent moral development of Tony's life had been an expansion of that initial commitment, a working out of its implications across increasingly complex terrain, the revelation of what his weapons has been used for, the decision to stop producing them, the decision to reveal his identity, the refusal of the easy management of heroism as something performed at a distance from personal accountability, the understanding arrived at through conflict and fracture with the people closest to him, that his instinct toward control was a version of the same instinct that had produced the weapons programs, the belief that problems could be solved by building sufficiently comprehensive systems, the failure to understand that the most significant problems are not engineering problems and cannot be addressed by engineering alone. By the time Tony reached the battle, he had already spent 5 years understanding something that most people spend their entire lives working around, that the life he'd been given to live was limited, that what he did with it had consequences that extended beyond his own experience of it, and that the correct response to this understanding was not anxiety, but a particular kind of seriousness. The seriousness of someone who has stopped managing the gap between who they are and what they believe and has closed it. The snap was not an act of courage in the conventional sense. Courage, conventionally understood, involves the overcoming of fear in the service of action, the doing of something despite the presence of the feeling that argues against doing it. What Tony experienced in the moment of the snap was not quite this. There was fear, certainly. Fear is present in every situation where the stakes are final, where the outcome of what you're about to do is irreversible, where the body understands that the person it has spent a lifetime serving is about to ask of it the one thing it cannot recover from. But the fear was not the dominant register. The dominant register was something closer to clarity. Clarity is not the same as peace. It does not feel like peace when you are inside it. It feels like the removal of everything that is not essential, the falling away of all the considerations that are usually present when decisions are being made, the self-interest and the risk calculation and the desire to find an option that costs less, until what remains is the decision itself, unencumbered, sitting there in the mind with the particular simplicity of things that have been stripped of all their surrounding complexity. Tony saw what needed to be done. He saw that he was the only one who could do it. He saw what it would cost. These 3 facts existed in his mind simultaneously, without friction, without the need for extended deliberation. The deliberation had already been done. The entire arc of his life had been the deliberation. Pause here. Let your body be completely still. Breathe in very slowly and breathe out even more slowly, and in the space of that breath, consider this. A person can spend their entire life building toward a single moment without knowing that is what they are doing. The choices accumulate. The character deepens, the values become more genuine and less performed. The understanding of what actually matters becomes clearer and less cluttered by what was mistakenly thought to matter. And then the moment arrives, and the person who's been building toward it, without design, without intention, through the simple cumulative operation of living as honestly as they could manage, meets it with everything that the building has produced. This is what Tony Stark's life had been. Not a preparation for the snap in any deliberate sense. He had not known, at 15 or 25 or even 40, that a moment of this kind was coming. But the life he lived, the changes he moved through, the values he arrived at and refined and increasingly inhabited rather than performed, all of it had produced the person who stood on that battlefield with the stones in his hand and understood, without anguish and without hesitation, what the moment required. The question of what the snap meant not practically but philosophically, not in terms of its mechanism but in terms of what it said about the nature of the universe it occurred in, occupied more thoughtful minds than Tony's in the months and years following the battle. Philosophers who had spent their careers thinking about the nature of agency and the relationship between individual choice and collective outcome found in the event a case study of unusual clarity. One individual, possessing the relevant capability, choosing to use it in a particular way, producing a consequence that affected every other individual in the universe simultaneously. The scale was unprecedented, but the structure of the choice was recognizable. It was simply the structure of any significant choice, made by someone who understood what was at stake and who chose fully, amplified to the largest possible dimensions. What made Tony's choice philosophically interesting, rather than simply extraordinary in its scale, was the specific quality of the understanding he brought to it. He did not choose blindly. He did not sacrifice himself out of impulse or out of the specific form of moral vanity that sometimes produces self-destruction in the name of virtue. He chose with full knowledge of what he was giving up. Not only his life in the abstract, but the specific life he'd been living. The morning on the dock, the coffee, Morgan's voice, Pepper's presence in the rooms of the house they had made together. He chose in full possession of what he was losing. This is the most demanding form of sacrifice. Not the sacrifice made in ignorance of the cost, or the sacrifice made in the urgency of a moment that forecloses the possibility of full reckoning, but the sacrifice made with complete knowledge after the reckoning has already been done. The reckoning had been done in the night before he brought the solution to the compound. He had sat with the full weight of it, the life on one side, the universe on the other, the equation that any honest accounting produced, and he had arrived at the only conclusion his values allowed, not dramatically, not with the performance of anguish. Simply, he had understood what the situation required, and he had understood that he was the only one who could provide it, and he had moved from that understanding into action with the quiet purposefulness of someone who has finished deliberating and begun doing. The night of deliberation was private, the action was public. Only the outcome survived in the record. The philosophical tradition that is concerned with the question of what makes a life well lived has many answers, and they disagree with each other in fundamental ways about what the well-lived life looks like. But one thread that runs through many of these different answers is the idea that the well-lived life is coherent, that the person who lives it is the same person in their private hours as in their public ones, that their actions express their values rather than contradict them, that the distance between who they are and what they do has been reduced through effort and honesty and the patient, often painful work of alignment. Tony's life, by its end, had achieved this. Not perfectly, not without the remainder of failures and regrets and things that could not be undone. But genuinely, in the fundamental sense, he was living by the end as the person he actually was, doing the things that the person he actually was would do, without the management of the gap between the public version and the private one. The 5 words he said were simple. They are, in the language of philosophy, what is called a performative utterance, a statement that does not describe a state of affairs but creates one, that is itself the action it refers to. He was not reporting that he was Iron Man. He was being Iron Man, completely and without remainder, for the last time and in the most total possible sense. The statement was the action was the person. There was no gap. What followed was the restoration of half the universe, the return of billions of lives that had been extinguished by a calculation that had called itself mercy, and had been, In fact, the most catastrophic expression of certainty the universe had yet produced. The snap reversed this. The dust that had settled over 5 years of absence reconstituted itself into people, into presence, into all the specific weight and warmth of individual human lives, and the cost was Tony Stark, the specific irreplaceable fact of him, traded for the specific irreplaceable fact of them. Is this a fair trade? The question arrives with the specific insistence of questions that have no clean answer, that gesture toward a dimension of ethics that is not accessible through simple calculation. Billions against one is, in the arithmetic, obvious, but the arithmetic of lives is not simply addition, and the one that was traded was not simply one. It was the particular irreplaceable configuration of intelligence and care and hard-won understanding that had made the trade itself possible, the person without whom the trade could not have been made. The universe received billions of people back and lost the one person who could do what had been done to give them back. Whether this is fair depends on what you think value is and how you think it should be counted. Tony's answer to the question, had he been able to answer it afterward, would probably not have engaged with the fairness at all. He was not a philosopher in the formal sense. He was an engineer. He saw what needed to be built and he built it. He saw what needed to be done and he did it. The fair or unfair of it was irrelevant to the question of what the moment required, and the moment had required this, and he had done it. That was the sum of it from inside the decision. From outside, the sum is larger. It includes everything that followed from the doing, every life lived in the restored universe, every morning met by someone who would not have met it otherwise. The sum, from outside, is incalculable. Let that incalculable thing settle around you, not as weight, but as warmth. You are held by something enormous. The story that contains you is larger than any single person, and is also, entirely, about the choices of single people. Both of these things are true at once. Let them both be true as your eyes grow heavier, and the words become something more like music than meaning, carrying you gently down. Notice for a moment how your body is arranged right now, the weight of it, the specific places where it makes contact with the surface beneath you, and the warmth that has accumulated at those places over the time you have been resting. You have been still long enough that the surface has begun to carry the impression of you, the quiet record of your presence. This is what belonging to a place feels like, not in the dramatic sense, but in the simple, physical sense. You belong to this space right now. It has made room for you. There are friendships that form easily, through the recognition of similarity, through the comfortable discovery that another person shares your frame of reference, and your humour, and your sense of what matters, and these friendships are a genuine gift. And then there are the other kind, the ones that form through friction, through the sustained encounter with someone who sees things differently and will not pretend otherwise, through the long, difficult, often irritating process of being challenged by a specific other person across time. These are harder to form and tend to be more durable and are often, when they're lost, more deeply mourned. Steve Rogers and Tony Stark were the second kind. They had almost nothing in common except the thing that made them both who they were. A fundamental orientation toward doing what was right even when it was costly. A refusal of the comfortable option when the uncomfortable one was the correct one. A specific incapacity for the kind of self-deception that allows most people to live without confronting the distance between their values and their actions. This shared orientation was not what drew them together. It was, in the early years, precisely what produced their friction. Because two people who share this quality but disagree about its implications tend to produce conflicts that neither can easily retreat from. Their first extended collaboration involved a sustained argument about accountability. Tony believed in structure. He believed that the extraordinary capability he and others like him possessed required extraordinary oversight, not because he distrusted his own judgment, but because he understood that even the most reliable judgment operates in a context of limited information and personal bias, and that the history of individuals who believed themselves qualified to operate without external accountability did not recommend this approach. Steve believed in conscience. He believed that accountability that superseded the judgment of the person acting was, in certain decisive circumstances, indistinguishable from complicity with wrong. Neither of them was entirely right. This is worth sitting with. The specific complexity of two people, both of whom are genuinely intelligent and genuinely ethical, and genuinely committed to getting the right answer, disagreeing fundamentally about what the right answer is. There is no clean resolution to this kind of disagreement. It does not resolve through one person winning the argument. It resolves, if it resolves at all, through time and experience and the accumulation of evidence that neither position as stated can fully accommodate the range of situations it will eventually face. The fracture that opened between them over the Accords was real, and it was not simple. It was built from more than the single argument it appeared to be. It contained within it all the years of friction, all the accumulated history of two people who had never quite managed to fully trust each other, despite genuinely caring about each other's well-being, all the specific personal injuries that had been added to the structural disagreement, and that made it harder than it would otherwise have been to hold the disagreement clearly separate from the feelings it activated. They said things to each other during that period that carried the specific weight of things said by people who know where the vulnerable places are and, in the heat of the dispute, do not hold back from them. What survived the fracture was more interesting than what might have survived an easier relationship. An easy relationship broken by conflict of that magnitude tends to stay broken. There is not enough structural depth to contain the kind of rupture that fundamental disagreement produces. But the relationship that Steve and Tony had was not easy, had never been easy, had been built from the beginning through the kind of sustained engagement that produces something more like a load-bearing structure than a surface connection. The fracture did not destroy it. It left it damaged and impaired and carrying unresolved weight, but intact in the ways that mattered. They came back together in the field, not through a conversation that addressed the years of rupture. The crisis did not allow for that, and perhaps neither of them was yet ready for it, but through the recognition that the thing they shared, the fundamental orientation they had both been expressing through their disagreement, was more important than the disagreement itself. They fought side by side with the specific efficiency of people who have worked together long enough to understand each other's movement and who trust, at the physical level if not yet at every other level, that the other person is reliable in the ways that matter most in a battle. The specific texture of their arguments, Steve's and Tony's, was not always about the things they appeared to be about. This is common in relationships of long standing, where the surface disagreement and the underlying one are related but not identical, where the immediate argument carries the weight of older patterns and deeper concerns that have not been directly addressed. Steve and Tony argued about accountability and oversight and the proper relationship between extraordinary capability and democratic institutions, and these arguments were real and worth having. But underneath them there was a more personal argument, quieter and less clearly articulated, about what it meant to be trustworthy and how trust was established, and whether the trust that each of them was being asked to extend to the other was a reasonable thing to ask. Tony, for much of their shared history, did not fully trust Steve's judgment about the practical dimensions of the team's operations. Not because Steve's judgment was poor, but because Tony's relationship to trust in other people's judgment had been shaped by a long history of discovering that even intelligent and well-intentioned people made errors that he could have prevented if he'd been more directly in control. This was not arrogance exactly, though it expressed itself in ways that resembled arrogance. It was a specific form of anxiety, the anxiety of someone who had learned, at considerable cost, that the gap between good intentions and good outcomes was large enough to have devastating consequences, and who had responded to this learning by working to reduce his dependence on anyone else's intentions being sufficient. Steve, for his part, did not fully trust Tony's capacity for the kind of deference that institutional accountability required, not because Tony was unwilling to be accountable, but because Tony's form of accountability was always personal rather than structural, always rooted in his own judgment about what the situation required, rather than in the established procedures that existed to manage the situations where individual judgment was insufficient. These two trust deficits fed each other across years of working together, each person's inability to fully trust the other, producing the very behaviors that confirmed the other's reasons for not fully trusting. It was a system as closed and self-perpetuating as any of the mechanical systems Tony had spent his career understanding and redesigning. The fracture was, in some sense, this system reaching the limit of what it could contain. When Tony died, Steve was left with something unusual and very specific: the grief for a person with whom the relationship had never reached its natural conclusion. Not because they had run out of time in the ordinary sense, not because of the usual accumulation of years and distance that slowly renders relationships incomplete, but because the specific kind of resolution that their particular relationship required, the working through of what the fracture had been about and what it had cost and what could be reclaimed from it, had been interrupted by an event that made the working through permanently impossible. Tony was gone. The conversation was over. Whatever Steve had wanted to say, or to understand, or to offer by way of acknowledgement, he would now say and understand and offer to an absence. The quality of this grief is worth naming precisely, because it is common and because it is not always recognized for what it is. It is the grief of the unfinished, not the grief of a relationship that was finished and then ended, but the grief of a relationship that was still in process, still moving through the difficult middle terrain between fracture and resolution, and that was ended before the process could complete. The person you grieve in this case is not only the person, but the possible future of the relationship, the version of it that might have emerged if there had been more time, the conversation that might have happened, the specific quality of understanding that might have been reached. Steve carried this to the end of his own story in this timeline, carried it along with everything else he carried. The specific accumulated weight of the century he had been alive and awake for parts of. The losses that had preceded Tony's and the losses that had followed. The long view that his particular history had forced on him. He made his choice eventually. The one that took him back to a time where he could live the life he had been unable to live in the present. And in making that choice he made peace with the full weight of what he was leaving, including the unfinished conversation with Tony, which he set down somewhere in his long walk through time, releasing it to the permanent, unresolvable status that some things simply occupy. The friendship. And it was a friendship underneath and through all the friction and the disagreement and the fracture, had produced something real in both of them. It had made Tony more willing to consider that his certainty about systems was not the same as certainty about outcomes. It had made Steve more willing to consider that conscience operating without any structure is not a guarantee against error. Neither of them had conceded the argument formally. Both of them had been changed by the years of holding it. Take a long breath now. Let the chest rise and the shoulders softened, and the breath find its way all the way down before it turns and rises again. The room is very quiet. The night is very long and generous, and there's no demand on you for anything. Simply the story, moving through the air around you, finding you where you are. What Steve and Tony's relationship leaves behind as a thing for the rest of the world to learn from is not a model for how to agree or how to resolve conflict. It is a model for how to maintain genuine engagement with someone you fundamentally disagree with, across time and difficulty, without collapsing the disagreement into simple opposition. They did not stop caring about each other because they disagreed. They did not reduce each other to the position they argued from. They held the complexity of the other person, the full person, not the representative of an opposing view, present in their understanding even when the disagreement was at its sharpest. This is a form of respect that most people are not very good at. They were not perfectly good at it either, but they did it, imperfectly and consistently for years, and the world the story belongs to is better for the specific quality of that sustained, difficult, genuine engagement. The blue light and the shield. Two symbols that existed in the same universe and knew each other and argued with each other and fought beside each other, and at the end, each did the thing that the other could not do. Tony gave everything in one moment. Steve gave everything slowly, across years, the accumulated toll of a life that had asked more of him than any life is designed to accommodate. Both of them, in their different ways, paid the full cost. Neither of them, in the end, asked for the receipt. The night deepens. Your breath deepens with it. The words are slower now. Or perhaps they only feel slower because your mind is moving at the pace of sleep, and from that pace the words seem to stretch and soften. Let them. Let everything soften. The story is here, and it is safe, and it knows the way to morning. The breath comes and goes without asking your permission, and this is one of the things the body does best, the work that continues while the mind rests. The systems that keep running in the background of your sleep, tending to the ongoing business of being alive without requiring your oversight. You can trust this. You've always been able to trust this even when you forgot you could. The body knows what it is doing. Let it do it. There is a room in every complicated person's life that is smaller than all the other rooms and more true. It is the room where the performance finally stops, where the armour comes off in whatever sense armour can come off, the habitual posture, the managed distance, the careful deployment of wit and brilliance as a substitute for the more vulnerable currency of genuine presence. For Tony Stark, this room was first his workshop, and then, over the long years of his relationship with Pepper, it became something else. It became the ordinary kitchen of an ordinary morning, and the dock at the end of an ordinary day, and the particular texture of a life that had given up pretending to be something other than what it was. Pepper Potts had seen through Tony Stark long before Tony Stark had seen through himself. This is not unusual. The people who are positioned to see us clearly are often not ourselves, not because we are dishonest, but because the angle is wrong, because we are too close to our own architecture to perceive its shape accurately. Pepper had the distance. She had also the intelligence, the specificity of attention, and the particular kind of care that involves seeing someone as they are rather than as they present themselves, and finding in what is actually there something worth caring about. She had made a decision about him early. not the decision to love him, which arrived later and by a different path, but the prior and more fundamental decision to take him seriously as a person rather than as a personality. This distinction mattered enormously. Tony had spent most of his life in environments where people engage with his personality, with the wit and the performance and the overwhelming capability on display, while maintaining a comfortable distance from the person underneath it. Pepper declined this arrangement. She engaged with what was underneath, not through any dramatic confrontation with his defences, but simply by refusing to pretend that the defences were the whole of it, by consistently responding to the real person rather than the performance. The love that eventually developed between them was not the kind that announces itself suddenly. It was the kind that arrives after a long time of knowing, that is continuous with the knowing rather than a break from it, that adds a dimension to a relationship that was already real and substantial without quite transforming it into something different. They had been essential to each other for years before the word for it was available. The word was just the acknowledgement of what had already been true, the formal recognition of a fact that the years of working beside each other had gradually made undeniable. What Pepper carried after the snap was not a single emotion but a landscape of them, complex and internally contradictory in the way that grief tends to be when it arrives for someone who was both a beloved person and a defining condition of your life. Tony had been the former for many years and the latter for much longer, and the two categories interacted in her grief with the specific complexity of things that have been intertwined for long enough that they cannot be cleanly separated. She mourned the person, and she also mourned the configuration of the world that his presence had maintained. The specific texture of the life they had built together, the house by the lake, the mornings on the dock, the ordinary architecture of a happiness that had taken most of two people's adult lives to construct. She had told him they would be okay. These were the last words she said to him while he was still alive to hear them, and they were chosen with the precise care of someone who understands that last words, if there are to be last words, should carry the maximum density of what is true and what is needed. They would be okay was true. She believed it, in the way she believed everything she said with intention, which was completely and without the protection of uncertainty. It was also what he needed to hear, needed in the specific sense that a person who has just done what Tony had done needed, someone who loved him, to tell him that the cost he had paid was not a cost that would be paid again in a second form by the people he was dying to protect. Morgan was 3 years old at the time of the snap, which meant that the Morgan who would grow into knowing what she had lost was largely a different person from the one who experienced the loss. This is the specific arithmetic of grief in very young children. The loss is complete and real and present in the absence it creates, but the understanding of what was lost accumulates slowly, arrives in stages, each stage revealing a new dimension of the absence that the previous stage did not have the framework to perceive. She would lose him again, in this sense, at 7 and at 12 and at 17 and at 25, each new phase of her growing revealing a new category of thing she would have needed him for. What Pepper worked hardest to give her was not information about Tony, not the biographical facts, not the public story, not the version of him that existed in the world's understanding, and that was, by necessity, incomplete, and in some respects incorrect. What she worked to give her was texture, the specific quality of his presence, the particular way he laughed, the manner in which he held a problem when he was genuinely interested in it, the sound of his voice in the house in the early morning before anyone else was awake. These things were not recoverable from the public record. They belonged to the private room, the one where the armor was off, and Pepper was their primary custodian. The house by the lake was also a custodian. It held the shape of the 5 years they had lived in it, the marks on the doorframe where Morgan's height had been recorded, the specific wear on the dock from years of early morning standing, the workshop that still smelled of the work, the kitchen where the coffee had been made on the mornings that were the specific texture of the peace Tony had finally been allowed to inhabit. Pepper chose to stay in it, at least for a time, not because leaving it was impossible. She was not the kind of person who makes herself a prisoner of the past, but because staying in it was a form of faithfulness to what had been real there, a refusal to let the house become only a house again. She returned eventually to Stark Industries, to the work that Tony had left in her hands, and she carried both of her inheritances with her, the institutional one, which was enormous and complex and requiring, and the personal one, which was quieter but in many ways more defining. The personal one expressed itself in how she led, in the specific quality of seriousness she brought to the question of what the company was for, in her insistence that the work mattered beyond its commercial outputs, in the way she held Tony's implicit ethical commitments in view when decisions needed to be made about direction. Sit with this, for a breath, in the quiet. The image of a person who carries another person's values forward, not as an imitation, but as a living continuation, not pretending to be Tony, but genuinely shaped by the years of proximity to who he had been, by the specific moral seriousness underneath the performance, the genuine care for what happened to people, the belief that the technology was not neutral, and that the people who built it were responsible for what it did in the world. These were not things Pepper had received as instructions. They were things she had observed over years expressed in action, and that had been absorbed into the framework through which she made her own decisions. This is the most intimate form of legacy, the one that operates through people who loved the person and continue to be shaped by the loving. Morgan grew. This is not a simple thing to say. Growing for the person who is growing is usually the least remarkable thing happening, the thing that simply continues while attention is directed elsewhere. But the specific shape of Morgan's growing was interesting, because she was growing into the inheritance from both directions simultaneously, from Pepper's careful custodianship of what Tony had been privately, and from the world's custodianship of what Tony Stark had meant publicly. She was in the unusual position of having access to both versions, of being able to hold them together in her understanding rather than having to choose between them. What she eventually made of this inheritance was her own. It could not be otherwise. The children of the remarkable are always making something of their own from what they were given, always negotiating the specific terms under which they will honour the legacy without being defined by it, always finding the thread in the inheritance that connects to what they actually are rather than what they are expected to be. Morgan's intelligence was obvious early, as these things tend to be when they are genuinely present. What she did with it, and in what direction she pointed it, and what values she chose to organize it around. These were the work of her own life, conducted in the space that Tony and Pepper had built for her and then given over to her to use as she needed. The years that Pepper had spent watching Tony learn to live had given her a specific kind of knowledge that no outside observer of his public career could have acquired, the knowledge of what the learning had cost him, and what it looked like from the inside when a person who had spent decades moving very fast and very deliberately finally stopped and allowed themselves to simply be in the life they had arrived at. She had watched him adapt to stillness the way a fast-running river adapts when it reaches a wide, shallow place, gradually with residual agitation at the edges but genuinely and increasingly. The mornings on the dock had not been performance. They had been the thing itself, the actual achievement of a quality of presence he'd been working toward without knowing it, for longer than either of them could precisely date. What she preserved of him for Morgan was not a monument, but a living understanding, the kind that can actually be used, that can be brought to bear on the specific situations a person encounters as they grow. That says something useful rather than simply reverential. She preserved him as someone who had been wrong and had changed, who'd been afraid and had acted anyway, who had loved imperfectly and had kept working to love better, who had made things that he was proud of and things that he regretted, and who had found, at the end of a long and complicated life, the specific peace that comes from having finally become the person you were capable of being. This was a usable inheritance. This was something Morgan could actually carry. The armour, in all its forms, had come off, not in the sense of defeat. Tony had not been defeated by the world or by his limitations or by the enemies who had tried to reach him through the years of his heroism. He had been finished, completed. The arc that his life had described had arrived at its end in the way that well-constructed arcs arrive at their ends, not through interruption but through culmination, the narrative reaching the place that the entire shape of it had been moving toward. What remained when the armour came off, when the light in the chest went out, when the performance and the capability and the brilliant restless motion that had defined him finally stilled? What remained was this: Pepper, Morgan, the house by the lake, the work that continued, the people who carried his values forward, the world he had bought with the expenditure of himself. What remained was everything that mattered, everything that had always mattered, and that he had spent so many years learning to recognize as what mattered, and that he had finally, in the 5 years by the lake, allowed himself to simply inhabit. Let your breath be very slow. Let the image of a small house by still water carry you. The mist is on the surface and the light is early and the dock extends into the quiet and no one is asking anything of you. You can rest here as long as you need. The dark is complete now, or close to it, and your body has settled into the particular heaviness of someone who's been still for a long time and has stopped noticing that they are being still, which is close to the condition of sleep, even if sleep itself has not yet arrived. The story is around you, warm and continuous. You do not need to track it closely. Simply let it be present, the way music is present in a room even when no one is consciously listening. There, always there, doing its work. When a person who has occupied a significant position in a system leaves that system, the space they occupied does not stay empty. It cannot. The pressures and obligations that the position responded to are still present, still requiring response. And the absence of the person who was responding to them creates a demand that draws others into the space, reshapes them in the process of inhabiting it, and produces people who are not the person who was there before, but who are themselves, genuinely and specifically, in ways the previous person could never have anticipated. James Rhodes had been in Tony's world for longer than almost anyone. They'd met in college, at MIT, in the specific way that people sometimes meet when they are both carrying an unusual amount of capability and an unusual amount of seriousness about what to do with it, and they had recognized each other across the difference of their backgrounds with the directness of people who are past the point of being surprised by where genuine quality can be found. The friendship had been foundational in the way of the best early friendships, shaping, defining, providing a specific reliable presence against which the developing self could orient itself across decades of change. Rhodey had spent most of the years of Tony's heroism in a position of productive tension. supporting what Tony did while operating within a military structure that had its own complex relationship to the existence of people like Tony, its own obligations and constraints and institutional logic that sometimes aligned with Tony's choices and sometimes diverged from them sharply. He had worn his own armour through most of this, which was its own statement. The choice to be present in the field, to be the version of the military's engagement with superhuman capability that had a face and a conscience, and the specific judgment of a person who had been in combat and understood what was actually at stake when decisions were made at the level of force. After Tony, Rhodey carried something that was not available to the other people who mourned him. The specific weight of knowing Tony not primarily as a hero, but as a person, as the person he had been before the cave and the arc reactor and the suit, the person who had existed before the public version of Tony Stark had been constructed, and who had persisted underneath that construction, even when the construction was most complete. This knowing gave Rhodey's grief a texture that was different from anyone else's, denser and more particular, full of things that could not be made public because they belonged to the private archive of a friendship that had accumulated across most of a lifetime. He continued to operate in the field after Tony's death, which was never really in question for him. It was what he did, it was who he had decided to be, and Tony's absence did not remove the conditions that made the doing of it necessary. But there was a quality to his presence in the field after the snap that was different from before, a particular deliberateness, the sense of someone who is carrying more than their equipment, who is bringing to each engagement not only the capability that the armour provided, but the knowledge of what had been paid for the right to engage at all, the specific awareness of the cost that had been borne so that he could continue to stand in the places where his presence was needed. Sam Wilson had come to the position he eventually occupied through a different path from Rhodey's, through the world of veterans therapy and the specific understanding of loss and transition that belongs to people who work with those who have survived what they did not expect to survive, who have come home from places that did not simply release them when they left. He understood, from long experience with the people he worked with, that identity is constructed through action across time, that who a person is cannot be separated from what they have done and what they have been willing to do, and that the question of who they are after the action has ended is always the real question. His relationship with Steve had preceded his relationship with Tony in any meaningful sense, and it was through Steve that he had been drawn into the larger world that contained both of them. He had watched Tony from a particular vantage, the vantage of someone who had no prior relationship with the public version of Tony Stark and therefore no particular investment in it, who could see the person with the clarity that is sometimes available to observers who have not been shaped by the mythology. What he saw was someone who had done the work of becoming genuinely accountable, who had moved from the defensive deployment of capability to its open and responsible use, and who had paid, ultimately, the price that this kind of accountability tends to exact from the people who take it seriously enough. The question of who would take up the shield after Steve was separate from the question of who would carry Tony's legacy forward, and the answers to the two questions were different, but they intersected in interesting ways. The shield was a symbol with its own history and its own weight, and its own specific demands on the person who carried it. Tony's legacy was not encapsulated in any single object. It was distributed across technology and values, and the people he had shaped, and the world he had purchased. What it demanded of the people who inherited it was not the carrying of a specific object, but the inhabiting of a specific orientation toward responsibility. Both Sam and Rhodey inhabited this orientation, though in their different ways and from their different vantage points, and both of them understood, without it being stated, because some things are transmitted through proximity and shared experience rather than through statement, that what they were doing carried the weight of what had made it possible, that the field they operated in, the restored world they moved through, the people they were protecting, and the capability they were deploying were all there because one person had decided that the cost was worth paying and had paid it. There is a form of honor that is not performed. It does not announce itself. It does not require ceremony or acknowledgement or the naming of the debt. It is simply the quality of seriousness that a person brings to work that they understand to have been purchased at enormous cost by someone who is no longer present to see it done. This quality was visible in both of them, in the specific gravity they brought to their engagement with the ongoing work of the world. Not somber, neither Sam nor Rhodey was a somber person by nature, and the grief they carried did not convert their natures into something they were not, but serious in the precise sense, aware of the weight and unwilling to pretend it was lighter than it was. There is a specific quality that the people who work in the aftermath of great events carry, a quality that is not exactly burden and not exactly privilege, but something of both simultaneously. They are the people who must make the restoration real in the specific, local, daily terms that large events never address directly. The snap restored billions of lives. It did not restore the infrastructure that those lives required, did not restore the relationships that had been restructured around the absence, did not address the specific grief of the people who had learned to live without someone and now had to learn to live with them again, differently, across a distance that 5 years had opened. All of that work was human work, local work, the unsexy and invisible work of taking the enormous fact of what had happened and translating it into the 1,000 small negotiations that constitute actual life. Rhodey and Sam were, in different ways, central figures in this translation work. In the practical dimension of it, the ongoing management of a world that was healing from a wound of unusual depth, and that required the continued presence of people willing to show up where the healing was incomplete and where the vulnerability was real. This was not the dramatic work of the battlefield. It did not produce the visible, legible victories that heroism tends to be associated with. It was slower and less legible, and more genuinely demanding than the work of any single crisis, because it was the work of the long middle, the period after the acute emergency has passed, and before the full recovery has been achieved, when the people who are supposed to be okay are not quite okay, and when the structures that are supposed to be restored are not quite restored, and when the sustained attention of capable people is the most important and least glamorous thing in the world. Both of them did this work because it needed to be done, and because they were the people who could do it, and because Tony had, in the most fundamental sense, made it possible for them to be there to do it. The debt was not spoken. It was not the kind of thing that serves any purpose to speak. It was simply present, the way the ground is present beneath a building, not visible from the outside, but foundational to everything that stands on it. Breathe slowly. Feel the surface beneath you, generous and solid. The story is in the middle of something large and is approaching its quieter end, and you are moving with it, not needing to track each step but present in the general movement of it, the way a person is present in a river, not swimming exactly, not fighting the current, simply moving with the water in the direction that the water is already going. The world that all of these people, Rhodey, Sam, Peter, Pepper, Steve in his way, were operating in was not simply the world restored. It was the world restored, plus the knowledge of what restoration had required. This additional knowledge was not a burden exactly, though it had weight. It was more like a form of context that could not be escaped, that shaped every decision about what to do with the restored world, that made certain kinds of casualness or carelessness about the opportunities that the restoration represented feel like a specific form of disrespect, not toward Tony in the personal sense, but toward the cost of the thing, toward the fact of what had been paid. They rose in his shadow in the sense that anyone rises in the shadow of the person who preceded them, who occupied the space they now occupy, who set certain terms for what that space requires. But they were not diminished by the shadow. They were, in different ways, enlarged by it, given a context for their work that made the work more serious and more significant than it would have been without that context, placed in relationship to a standard that was high enough to require something genuine of them, and human enough to be achievable rather than paralyzing. This is perhaps the most important dimension of legacy. Not the imitation it inspires, but the standards it establishes. Tony Stark's legacy did not require the people who followed him to become Tony Stark. It required them to be fully themselves in the way that Tony had, at great cost and over many years, finally managed to be fully himself, without the performance, without the management of the distance between who they were and what they did, without the comfortable armour of persona substituting for the more vulnerable and more true condition of genuine presence. Each of them was doing this, in their different ways, with their different capabilities and their different histories and their different understandings of what the work required. They were all doing the same essential thing, showing up fully as who they actually were, in service of a world that one man's complete expenditure of himself had made possible. The stars, if you could see them, are very still. The dark is enormous and patient and entirely without demand. You're held inside it, warm and small and safe, and the story is ending its long movement through the night. Rest now, a little more deeply. There is one more turn before the light. You are very deep now, not in any place that requires navigation, simply in the depth that gathers naturally when a person has been quiet for a long time in a safe place, when the ordinary noise of the thinking mind has gradually thinned to something closer to weather than to language, moving through rather than residing. The story has one more passage to make before it brings you to rest. Let it carry you. The universe is larger than the people in it can hold in mind. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is simply a fact about scale, about the relationship between human cognition and the actual dimensions of the reality it exists within. The universe contains a number of stars whose light reaches no eye, a number of planets whose surface no foot has touched, a number of events happening simultaneously at distances so vast that the light announcing them will not arrive for millions of years. The universe is not interested in being held in mind. It is simply occurring in all directions at once, at a pace that does not adjust for the limits of human comprehension. Against this scale, the act of one human being choosing to sacrifice himself on a battlefield on one planet seems, by the arithmetic of the universe, negligible. One person, one planet, one moment in the 4 billion years of that planet's existence. The universe as a whole would not notice. And yet the universe, as it was actually arranged in that moment, had been organized around exactly this. The 6 stones that Tony carried in his suit contained, between them, the foundational forces of the reality they were embedded in, space and time and mind and soul and power, and the very structure of what is real. Whoever held them held, in some sense, the universe in their hand. And Tony Stark, in the specific configuration of that particular moment, was the only person present who could have done what needed to be done with them. The scale collapses, the negligible becomes the pivot. This is one of the things that the story of Tony Stark demonstrates most clearly about the relationship between scale and significance. That the largest consequences are not always produced by the largest forces. Thanos had assembled his case for what the universe needed from the perspective of someone who thought in cosmic terms, who operated at the level of populations and resources and the abstract mathematics of sustainability. He had applied an enormous force toward an enormous outcome, and it had taken one human being standing in the specific place where the human scale intersected with the cosmic to undo it. The worlds that received the restored half of the universe did not all experience the return in the same way, because the restoration was not simply the reversal of an absence, but the return of specific individuals into specific contexts that had changed in the 5 years they were gone. Each world that had lost half its population had reorganized around that loss, had developed new structures and new relationships and new ways of managing the reduced condition it had been left in. The return of the lost was not a simple subtraction of 5 years of change, but the introduction of billions of people into situations that had moved on without them. This complexity was something the stones could not address. The mechanics of restoration did not include the healing of every dislocation that the restoration itself produced. That work was human work, the slow, local, patient work of individuals and communities and institutions negotiating the specific terms of a world that had been broken and was now also whole, and needed to find a way to be both of those things simultaneously. This is, in a sense, the most accurate description of the restored universe's condition, broken and whole at once, each in different respects, neither cancelling the other out. The cosmic dimension of what happened on that battlefield was registered in ways that the people involved could not directly perceive. Forces that operate at the level of fundamental physics do not announce their changes in forms that individuals can read. But the registration was real. The universe in which Tony Stark had lived and died was a different universe from the one that Thanos had briefly created with the first snap, and the difference was the direct consequence of the choice Tony had made. The fabric of what was real had been altered twice, and the second alteration was more than a reversal of the first. It was the imposition, by a human being's decision, of a specific outcome onto the largest canvas available. Let this settle for a moment in the most spacious part of your mind, the part that does not need to understand something in order to hold it. The universe is very large and very old, and has been through many things that no mind has been present to witness, and it will go through many more things after every mind currently present has ceased to exist. And within that vast and indifferent sweep, a person chose something, chose it deliberately and fully and at the cost of themselves, and the universe received the choice and was changed by it. There are beings in the universe that exist at scales and timelines that make even the cosmic events of Thanos' snap and Tony's counter-snap appear local. Ancient entities whose awareness extends across dimensions that human consciousness cannot access, whose relationship to the fundamental forces of existence is more direct and less mediated by the machinery of a biological body. Some of these beings have been watching, in whatever mode of watching was available to them, the long drama of Earth and its unusual density of individuals capable of extraordinary things. The specific outcome they observed, one human, using the most powerful objects in existence, choosing the particular expenditure of himself over the continuation of himself, was, in their understanding, an unusually clear example of something they had been watching for across the long history of the universe's inhabited worlds. The worlds that received the restored populations faced what might be called the problem of the double present, the specific condition of having two versions of the present simultaneously, one constructed across 5 years of adaptation to absence, and the other arriving all at once in the form of the people who had been absent. These two presents did not automatically reconcile. They required reconciliation, which is a form of work that is more patient and less dramatic than the work of the battlefield, but is in many respects harder, because it requires two parties who have each been through something real and consequential to find a way of being present with each other across the gap that their different experiences have opened. The people who'd returned were 5 years younger than they should have been, in a world that was 5 years older than they remembered. The buildings they had known had been repaired or rebuilt or left to weather. The relationships they had moved through had continued without them, had changed in ways that 5 years of absence makes inevitable. Children had grown, parents had aged, friendships had reconfigured around the space that the absent person had vacated. The return did not erase any of this. It added a new layer of reality on top of what had developed in the absence, and the work of managing both layers simultaneously was the specific challenge of the restoration's aftermath. Tony's choice had created the conditions for this challenge, had purchased the complexity along with the reunion. This is the full accounting of what the snap actually accomplished, not simply the restoration of half the universe to the status it had before Thanos, but the creation of an enormous, distributed, ongoing process of human beings trying to find each other again across a divide that the restoration had bridged but not erased. The bridging was the miracle. The not erasing was the human dimension of it, the part that could only be addressed by the people living through it day by day in the specific terms of their own specific lives. Tony had done the impossible part. The rest was left, as it should be left, to the people who remained. What they were watching for is not easy to name in language that was developed for human-scale experience. The closest available terms point towards something like the verification of meaning, the demonstration, through action rather than through argument, that the universe is the kind of place where choice matters, where what an individual decides to do has consequences that extend beyond the individual, where the gap between what is and what could be is susceptible to the intervention of a decision made freely and fully and without reservation. Tony Stark's snap was, in this sense, a data point in a very long inquiry, one that the universe registered in whatever way universes register things, and that altered the context of the inquiry going forward. Down at the human level, on the specific planet where the specific moment occurred, the registration was different. The data point was a person. The inquiry was a life. The alteration of context was grief and gratitude and the slow, complex work of understanding what had been done and what it meant and what it required of the people who remained. These two registers, the cosmic and the human, did not communicate directly. They did not need to. They were simply the same event understood from different distances, and at both distances the event was real, and at both distances the event had consequences, and at neither distance did the consequences not matter. What the universe looked like, in the weeks and months after the battle, from the perspective of the restored populations trying to find their way back into their own lives, was not primarily cosmic. It was local. It was the specific small room of a person discovering that the person they had been missing for 5 years was standing in their doorway, not having aged a single day. It was the specific small room of a person who had spent 5 years building a new life, discovering that the life they had built now had to accommodate someone who had returned from the absence. It was the specific intersection of private lives across the full breadth of half the universe, each intersection its own complete world, none of them smaller for being local. Tony had done something that affected every one of these intersections, not in any way that could be traced back to him from the perspective of any individual navigating the specific complexity of their own situation. The restored person who returned to a changed home did not think in most moments about who had made the restoration possible. They thought about the specific person in their doorway, the specific rooms of their specific life, the immediate and pressing work of being present in a world that had changed while they were gone. But Tony's choice was the condition of all of it, the invisible foundation. This is one of the ways that genuinely significant acts differ from merely dramatic ones. The dramatic act announces itself, requires an audience, depends on being seen and understood in order to achieve its intended effect. The genuinely significant act does its work in the structure of what follows, in the conditions it creates rather than in its own immediate display. Tony's snap was witnessed, but its significance was not primarily in the witnessing. Its significance was in the world that the witnessing was of, the specific condition of a restored reality, full of specific lives, going about their specific business in the specific light of a specific morning, completely unaware of the cost of the morning they were in. The air is different at this hour, cooler. The dark has reached its deepest point and is beginning, very slowly, to release its hold on the light that is always waiting behind it. You're in that same transition, the deepest point of the night, the place just before the quiet becomes the stillness of real sleep, where the story and the dream begin to change places without your knowing exactly when it happened. Let it happen. The universe is very large and very patient, and whatever you are moving toward is already there, waiting for you to arrive. You are almost there. The place you've been moving toward all night is very close now. Not a destination so much as a condition, not somewhere different from where you are, but somewhere deeper in the same place, accessible through the simple, continued act of releasing whatever small remaining tension the body is still carrying. Your breath is very slow. Your hands are open. The room around you is exactly the room it has always been, and you are exactly yourself in it, and both of these facts are sufficient. Both of these facts are everything. Every legacy has a form, not the form it is described in, not the biographical summary or the public account or the monument that societies build to contain the significance of people who mattered, but the form it actually takes in the fabric of ongoing life. The form that Tony Stark's legacy took was light, specifically a small, steady blue-white light, warm rather than cold, located at the center of the chest, saying simply and continuously, "Someone is here." The arc reactor was a survival device before it was a symbol, but symbols grow from the uses that life finds for them. And the use that life found for the arc reactor was the carrying of a specific meaning across years, and through enormous change without ever becoming something other than what it was. The light said, "I am here, and I choose to be here," and the choosing is ongoing and deliberate and not contingent on the conditions being easy. It said this when Tony was alone in the workshop at 4 a.m, working on a problem that had not yet yielded to his attention. It said this when he was in the field, in situations whose outcome was not certain, bringing everything the suit could give toward a resolution he could not guarantee. It said this in the 5 years by the lake, during which the choosing was quieter and more domestic, and required less of the dramatic capability that the public version of the light had always been associated with, but was no less real and no less deliberate for being quiet. When the light went out, it went out completely. This is important. There was no gradual dimming, no slow diminishment of the quality of presence that the light had stood for. Tony had been entirely present until the moment of the snap, and the snap had been the fullest possible expression of the presence rather than its withdrawal. The light went out because the man who carried it had given everything that the carrying required, had arrived at the final expression of the commitment the light had always represented, and had nothing left to hold. The going out was the completion, not the cancellation. But light, once produced, does not simply disappear. This is a physical fact and also a metaphorical truth, and in this case both registers apply simultaneously. The photons that the arc reactor emitted across the years of Tony's career have travelled outward into the universe at the speed of light, and some of them are still travelling and will continue to travel for a very long time. The light exists still in the fabric of what happened, and the other kind of light, the less physical kind, the kind that is stored in the people who saw it and in the decisions they made because of what they saw, and in the decisions that those decisions made possible. This kind persists in an even more immediate and accessible sense. Peter Parker carries it. He carries it in the specific quality of seriousness he brings to the work that his capability makes possible. The understanding, absorbed through years of watching, that the power is not the point, and the responsibility is not a burden added to the power from outside, but is intrinsic to it, is in fact the more important of the two. The suit is a tool. The values are the thing. Tony took decades to arrive at this understanding. Peter received it early, and will spend his life working out its implications, and the working out will be genuinely his own, even though its origin lies in what he was shown. Pepper carries it in the specific way she holds the question of what the company's for, in her refusal of the comfortable position that the technology is neutral and the only responsibility is commercial, in the ongoing work of trying to make the institution express the values that Tony had embedded in it, not through formal policy, but through the texture of how he had made decisions across the years of his leadership. She carries it also in Morgan, in every day of Morgan's life that Pepper has worked to make real and substantive, and connected to the full truth of who Tony was, rather than to the simplified public version that would have been easier to present. Rhodey carries it in the field, in the practical daily work of showing up with everything the armour can give in service of conditions that Tony had purchased with his life. He does not perform this inheritance. He does not make it visible or announce it. It is simply present in the quality of his presence, in the specific gravity that the people who work beside him can feel, even when they do not know its source. And Steve carries it in a different time, in a life that was finally allowed to be ordinary, in the specific ordinary mornings that Tony's extraordinary expenditure of himself made available not only to half the universe, but to the specific individual who needed most to finally rest. Steve's rest is also a gift from Tony. This is not obvious. It does not announce itself. But it is part of the same accounting. Take a breath now. Let it be the slowest one yet. In through the nose, very gently, all the way down to the lowest place, and then let it out even more gently, until the chest has released everything and is simply waiting, without urgency, for the next breath to come on its own schedule. The body knows. Trust the body. The arc reactor, in its final form, was a different object from the one that had been built in the cave. The cave version had been built from scrap, from improvisation, from the specific genius of someone who had nothing available but what was at hand and who had to make it work regardless. It was a survival device that happened to express in its design the complete state of Tony Stark's mind in the worst moment of his life, the economy of it, the precision, the refusal to waste a single component or a single insight on anything other than the problem that immediately mattered. Every version that followed was built in conditions of abundance rather than scarcity, with the full resources of Stark Industries and years of accumulated improvement behind it. But the original was the one that was most completely Tony, most fully the expression of what he was when there was nothing between him and the truth of himself. He had kept the original, not displayed it, not archived it in any formal sense, but kept it in the workshop in the way that people keep the things that were present at the moments that changed them, not for display but for reference, the physical object serving as an anchor for a memory that mattered too much to leave entirely to memory. The cave was always with him. Yinsen was always with him. This specific quality of the understanding he had arrived at in the dark under the mountain, the understanding that his life had to mean something, had to produce something worth the cost that had been paid on his behalf, this understanding was not symbolic. It was structural. It was the load-bearing element underneath everything that came after. What the blue light represented in the end was not power. It was commitment. The ongoing, renewable, daily commitment of a person who had chosen to take his own life seriously. Not in the sense of treating himself as more important than other people, but in the sense of treating what he did with his capability as a question that deserved honest engagement every day, without the comfortable distance of a person who has never been required to look directly at the consequences of what they have built and what they have enabled. Tony had looked. He had looked in the cave and in Afghanistan and in every quiet hour of the years that followed, and he had kept looking, and the looking had made him better in the specific, incremental, unglamorous way that sustained honest attention to one's own character tends to produce. The lake is still at this hour. The surface is perfectly flat, holding the early dark and the last stars without disturbance, without the ripples that the daytime wind puts in it. The dock extends over the water, and the house is quiet behind it, and somewhere in the house a small person is sleeping in the complete and trustful way that small people sleep when the world they know is safe, when the people responsible for their safety have done what was required, when the morning that is coming will arrive without catastrophe into a world that is, against considerable odds, intact. Tony Stark is not on the dock this morning. He's not anywhere that can be found on a map or visited by any traveller. But the dock is there, and the lake is there, and the house is there, and the small person sleeping in it is there, and all of these things are there because of a choice made in a moment by a person who had spent his entire life, without knowing it, becoming the person who could make that choice. The dock is his legacy. The stillness on the water is his legacy. The morning that is coming, with its ordinary light and its ordinary requirements and its ordinary gifts, is his legacy. You do not need to hold any of this. The story has been holding it for you, and will continue to hold it after you have let go of the last thread of wakefulness and moved into the other country that the night opens for you. The story does not require your attention to continue. It simply continues, the way the lake continues, the way the light from distant stars continues across the dark, the way all things that have been genuinely set in motion continue through their own momentum, long after the hand that set them moving has stilled. The blue light is everywhere and nowhere, dissolved into the fabric of a world that was made by it. You are in that world. Your breath is part of the air that Tony's choice made possible. The dark around you is a dark that exists because the restoration was real, and the morning will come because the morning was purchased, and you are resting inside something enormous that wears the modest clothing of an ordinary night. Let your eyes be completely still. Let the weight of your body be completely given over to whatever holds you. Let the last small grip of the wakened mind release its hold on the thread of the story and simply dissolve into it, the way a drop of water dissolves into the surface of a lake, without resistance, without remainder, completing the act of becoming part of something larger than itself. The light is out and the light is everywhere. The man is gone, and the man is in everything he made and everyone he loved and every morning that begins in the world he saved. Rest now. You are held. You are safe. The work is done, and it was enough. And so are you. If you liked this journey through the legacy of Iron Man, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. Sleep well.